The carbon fiber compound bows at the apex range cost more than a used car, and the men shooting them made sure everyone knew it. They laughed when the old veteran pulled a scarred piece of wood from a canvas sack, but the laughing stopped when the 200-yard target began to move. The Apex Precision Archery Club, nestled in the foothills of the Colorado Rockies, was less of a traditional shooting range and more of a country club for tactical gear enthusiasts. On a crisp Saturday morning in late October, the firing line hummed with the mechanical sounds of modern archery, the metallic click of drop-away arrow rests, the snap of precision thumb releases, and the aggressive whip-crack-thwack of carbon arrows breaking the sound barrier. At lane 4 stood Chad Huntington. Chad was 34, an aggressively successful commercial real estate developer, and a man who believed that any problem in life could be solved by swiping a platinum credit card. He was currently draped in head-to-toe Sitka camouflage, despite being 50 miles from the nearest hunting zone, and was fine-tuning a $3,500 Hoyt Vive TM 34 compound bow. The machine was a marvel of modern engineering, equipped with a digital Garmin bow sight, twin carbon stabilizers, and a complex cam system that reduced the physical effort of holding a drawn string to almost nothing. Beside him, his friends Bryce and Connor mirrored his setup, creating a wall of high-tech intimidation. Then the heavy glass door of the clubhouse opened, and Lucas Bennett walked in. Lucas didn't fit the Apex demographic. At 74 years old, he moved with the stiff but deliberate grace of a man who had spent his youth carrying heavy things through unforgiving terrain. He wore a faded flannel shirt, well-worn denim, and a pair of scuffed leather Red Wing boots that had been resoled at least 3 times. His silver hair was cropped close to his scalp, and his pale blue eyes held the calm, detached awareness of a man who observed everything but reacted to very little. In his right hand, he carried a long, battered canvas sleeve. "Hey, Liam," Lucas said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone, as he handed a crumpled $20 bill to the college student working the front register. "Just need an hour on the outdoor line." "Sure thing, Mr. Bennett," Liam smiled, though he shot a nervous glance toward the outdoor lanes. "Just a heads up, it's pretty crowded out there today. A lot of the tournament guys are getting ready for the Western Regionals." "I don't take up much space," Lucas replied, taking his lane tag. When Lucas stepped out onto the firing line, taking lane 9 at the far end of the facility, the metallic symphony of the range faltered for a brief moment. Chad lowered his Hoyt, a smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth as he nudged Bryce. "Get a load of this guy. Did he get lost on his way to a Civil War reenactment?" Lucas ignored the murmurs. He unzipped the canvas sleeve and slid out his bow. It was a handcrafted self-bow made of dense, golden-brown Osage orange wood. There were no pulleys, no fiberglass limbs, no sights, and no stabilizers. It was simply a continuous, elegant curve of wood, scarred and burnished by decades of sweat and natural oils. The grip was wrapped in dark, weathered leather. Placing the bottom tip against the instep of his boot, Lucas used his body weight to gracefully bend the thick wood, slipping the Flemish twist bowstring into the top notch. The old bow groaned softly, a deeply organic sound that stood out sharply against the sterile, metallic clicks of the compound bows. Lucas strapped a simple leather quiver to his hip. Inside were a dozen heavy wooden arrows. They weren't micro-diameter carbon shafts with plastic vanes. They were Port Orford cedar, fletched with real wild turkey feathers, barred in grey and white. "Hey, Grandpa," Chad called out, his voice carrying easily over the 60 yards separating them. "You know they invented the wheel, right? The Renaissance Fair is next weekend down in Denver." Bryce and Connor chuckled. A few other shooters down the line turned to watch, amused. Lucas didn't look up. He didn't tighten his jaw or show a flicker of annoyance. He simply pulled an arrow from his quiver, knocked it on the string by pure feel, and raised the bow. He didn't use a mechanical release aid. He used 3 calloused fingers, protected by a worn leather tab. He didn't hold the string back for 30 seconds, calculating yardage or checking a bubble level like Chad did. Lucas's draw, anchor, and release were a single, fluid, unbroken motion. Whisper thump. The wooden arrow flew in a high, graceful arc, completely different from the flat, laser-like trajectory of the modern bows. It struck the foam block target at 40 yards with a solid, resonant thud. Dead center. "Lucky shot," Bryce muttered. Lucas nocked another arrow. Whisper thump. The second arrow struck the target so close to the first that the wooden shafts clicked together. He fired 4 more times in under 2 minutes, a rhythm of pure, instinctual archery. When he was done, 6 arrows formed a cluster the size of a grapefruit right in the painted white heart of the target. For a normal archer, it was a brilliant display of traditional marksmanship. But to Chad, whose $3,500 rig was driving arrows into a group the size of a quarter at 80 yards, it was pathetic. And worse, Lucas's quiet competence was stealing the attention of the range. "Hey, old-timer," Chad projected his voice louder this time, stepping out of his lane and walking a few paces toward Lucas. "You're going to snap that piece of firewood out here. You want to try a real bow. I've got a backup in my truck. It'll shoot 300 feet per second. You won't have to aim at the clouds to hit a target at 50 yards. Lucas finally lowered his bow. He turned his head slowly, his pale blue eyes locking onto Chad's. There was no anger in the veteran's gaze, but there was a sudden, chilling weight to it. It was the look of a man who had seen things Chad could never buy a ticket to. "This piece of firewood," Lucas said quietly, "has never let me down. It shoots exactly where I look. That's all the speed I require." "Suit yourself," Chad scoffed, puffing out his chest. "Just try not to hold up the line when you start missing the foam and have to go digging in the dirt for your sticks." Lucas turned back to his target, his expression unreadable. But the piece of his morning routine had been fractured, and the young men to his left had no idea the kind of fire they were playing with. An hour passed. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning chill, and the wind began to sweep down from the mountains. A tricky, swirling crosswind that gusted unpredictably between 10 and 15 miles per hour. The wind wreaked havoc on the modern archers. Chad's tight groupings at 80 yards began to spread open. The carbon arrows, though lightning fast, were being pushed by the sudden gusts, causing Chad to curse loudly, adjust his digital sight, and blame his mechanical rest. He was growing visibly frustrated, aggressively wrenching his arrows out of the targets. Lucas, meanwhile, hadn't touched his sights, because he didn't have any. He shot instinctively. His brain unconsciously calculated the wind, the heavy mass of the cedar shafts, cutting through the gusts with surprising stability. He moved from 40 yards to 60 yards, his arrows consistently finding the vital zones of the 3D animal targets. This silent success gnawed at Chad's ego. He couldn't stand that this old man in a flannel shirt, shooting a primitive stick, was adapting to the elements better than his computer-machined equipment. Chad slammed his bow onto its kickstand and marched over to lane 9, Bryce and Connor trailing behind him like pilot fish. "All right, I've had enough of this Miyagi routine," Chad said, crossing his arms. "You think you're pretty good with that museum exhibit, don't you?" Lucas paused, an arrow half nocked. He sighed, the sound barely audible over the wind. "I'm just enjoying my Saturday, son. I suggest you go back to your lane and do the same." "Don't call me son," Chad snapped. "I'm just sick of traditional guys acting like they're morally superior because they refuse to use modern technology. You guys shoot at 40 yards and act like you're elite. Real archery, ethical archery, happens at distance, where precision actually matters." Lucas slowly lowered his arrow. A memory flashed in his mind, vivid and unbidden. The Ashau Valley, 1971. The suffocating jungle heat. His LRRP team pinned down, radio dead. The North Vietnamese army tracker closing in on their position. A gunshot would have given away their coordinates to the entire enemy battalion. Lucas, the son of a Montana bowyer, had brought a heavy takedown recurve into country against standard regulations. He had 70 yards, heavy brush, and a crosswind. One shot, one silent, perfectly placed arrow that saved his entire squad. He hadn't needed a digital sight then. He didn't need one now. "Precision matters," Lucas agreed, his voice dropping an octave, losing the polite veneer of an old man and taking on the hard, flat tone of a soldier. "But technology is just a crutch when the fundamentals are weak. When your batteries die, or your glass fogs up, or your little mechanical release jams, what are you left with?" Chad flushed red. "My fundamentals are flawless. I shoot competitively. I could outshoot you at any distance, any day of the week." "Then do it and leave me in peace," Lucas said, turning back to the range. "No, let's make it interesting," Chad pushed, his voice loud enough now that the entire firing line stopped. Men and women lowered their bows, turning to watch the confrontation. Even Liam, the kid from the front desk, had stepped outside, his eyes wide. Chad pointed a gloved finger down the extreme right side of the range. "See the coyote?" 200 yards away, sitting at the base of a grassy berm, was a steel and heavy-density foam target shaped like a coyote. It was mounted on a motorized steel track. It was the Apex Club's pride and joy, a custom-built rig designed for elite long-range rifle hunters and the most extreme compound bow shooters. When activated, the coyote would slide across a 30-yard opening at a brisk, erratic jogging pace, mimicking a fleeing predator. Hitting a stationary target at 200 yards with a compound bow was considered a masterclass feat, requiring the archer to aim several feet above the target, factoring in the steep parabolic drop of the arrow. Hitting a moving target at 200 yards in a 10-mile-per-hour crosswind was almost mathematically impossible. "I'll bet you $1,000 right now," Chad sneered, pulling his wallet out and slapping a stack of bills onto the wooden bench. "You take one shot, just one. If you can even clip the foam on that coyote while it's moving with that wooden toy, you take the cash. If you miss, you take your bow. You walk over to that dumpster, you break it in half, and you never come back to this club." A heavy silence fell over the range. The wind howled through the pine trees. Bryce shifted uncomfortably. "Chad, man, come on. It's an old guy. Leave it." "No," Chad said, his eyes locked on Lucas. "He wants to talk about fundamentals. Put your money where your mouth is, Grandpa." Lucas looked at the stack of money, then at Chad, and finally down at the long bow in his hand. He ran his thumb over the leather grip, right over a small series of notches carved into the wood. 7 notches. One for every man whose life this wood had saved 55 years ago. "Keep your money," Lucas said quietly. Chad laughed triumphantly. "Yeah, that's what I thought. All talk." "If I hit it," Lucas interrupted, his voice cutting through the wind like a physical blade. "You pack your gear into your truck. You leave this range. And you never speak down to another shooter as long as you live." Chad's smile vanished. He stared into Lucas's icy blue eyes and suddenly realized he wasn't looking at a frail old man. He was looking at a dormant volcano. But Chad's pride had a massive audience now. He couldn't back down. "You're on," Chad said, his voice tight. He turned to Liam. "Hey, fire up the track. Range is going hot for a specialty shot." The crowd murmured, pressing closer. About 20 archers gathered behind lane 9, giving Lucas a wide berth. Whispers rippled through the crowd. "It's 200 yards. He's shooting a self-bow. The arrow is going to drop 30 feet. He'll be lucky if he doesn't hit the parking lot." Lucas stepped up to the firing line. He didn't stretch. He didn't check the wind by tossing grass into the air. He simply stood there, his boots planted shoulder-width apart, rooting himself into the earth. He pulled a single cedar arrow from his quiver. He inspected the fletching, making sure the feathers were perfectly straight, and knocked it onto the string. 200 yards away, a red light flashed on the berm. A loud mechanical buzzer sounded, echoing across the open field. The steel coyote lurched forward, accelerating to a jarring, erratic jog across the 30-yard track. Lucas closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. The sounds of the whispering crowd, Chad's heavy breathing, and the mechanical hum of the modern bows faded away. There was only the wind brushing against his cheek, the solid weight of the earth beneath his boots, and the heartbeat thumping steadily in his chest. He opened his eyes, and the old veteran raised his bow to the sky. The wind whipped across the apex range, tearing dead leaves from the bordering oak trees and sending them dancing violently across the manicured grass. 200 yards downrange, the motorized steel coyote hummed and rattled along its track, moving at a brisk, unpredictable 8 miles per hour. To the men holding their precision-machined compound bows, the target looked like a speck. It was a shot that defied the capabilities of modern archery, let alone a piece of handcrafted wood. Lucas Bennett did not look at the coyote. He looked at the empty space of sky roughly 40 feet ahead of the moving target and 40 feet above it. He drew the heavy Flemish string back to his anchor point, his middle finger pressing into the corner of his weathered mouth. The 65-pound draw weight of the Osage orange self-bow caused the dense wood to bend in a terrifying, beautiful arc. The bow groaned, a deep, organic protest of stored kinetic energy. "Look at his angle," Bryce whispered, nudging Chad. "He's aiming at the clouds. He's going to put that arrow in the parking lot." Chad smirked, crossing his arms over his Sitka jacket. "I told you, the guy is delusional. This is going to be hilarious." Lucas blocked them out. He became a machine of flesh, bone, and instinct. His brain was performing complex calculus without a single conscious thought. He felt the 10-mile-per-hour crosswind biting at his right cheek. He knew the heavy, 600-grain Port Orford cedar arrow would lose velocity rapidly, taking nearly 3.5 seconds to cross the 200-yard expanse. In that time, gravity would pull the arrow down sharply, the wind would push it nearly 5 feet to the left, and the coyote would travel roughly 40 feet to the right. To hit the target, Lucas had to aim at absolutely nothing. He held his breath. The world narrowed down to the grey and white turkey feathers against his cheek and the invisible intersection of time, speed, and wind in the sky. He relaxed his 3 fingers. The release was a whisper. The heavy wooden bow thumped dully, absorbing the shock, and the long cedar arrow launched into the atmosphere. For the spectators standing behind lane 9, The next 3 seconds felt like a localized suspension of time. The crowd gasped as they tracked the arrow's flight. It did not fly flat and fast, like a modern carbon shaft. It climbed high into the October sky, a dark, heavy needle soaring upward in a massive, sweeping parabolic arc. At the apex of its flight, it seemed to hang suspended against the grey clouds. "No way," Liam, the range attendant, breathed out, his hands gripping the wooden railing of the clubhouse deck. The arrow began its descent. As it dropped, the vicious crosswind caught the heavy cedar shaft, bowing its flight path to the left. At the exact same moment, the steel coyote continued its mechanical jog to the right. The converging geometry was impossible. The arrow was falling from the sky, accelerating as gravity reclaimed it, and the coyote was jogging blindly into the kill zone. The heavy cedar shaft plummeted. The grey and white feathers spun wildly, stabilizing the broadhead tip. Crack! It was not the dull, soft thud of an arrow hitting foam. It was a violent, percussive detonation that echoed all the way back to the firing line. Downrange, the motorized coyote violently shuddered. The heavy wooden arrow had not just clipped the target. Descending at a steep 45-degree angle with the mass of a small spear, the cedar shaft struck the high-density foam insert of the coyote perfectly in the vital ring. The kinetic energy was so immense, and the angle so severe, that the arrow drove downward through the core of the target, splitting the dense foam block entirely in half. The front half of the synthetic animal exploded outward, raining chunks of material across the grass, while the steel track ground to an abrupt grinding halt. The range fell into a stunned, breathless silence. The only sound was the wind howling through the valley. Chad Huntington's mouth was slightly open, his arms uncrossed, falling limply to his sides. He stared downrange, his eyes wide with a mixture of horror and absolute disbelief. Bryce and Connor looked like they had just witnessed a ghost. "He split it," someone in the crowd whispered, their voice trembling. "He completely destroyed the insert, from 200 yards, moving." Lucas did not celebrate. He did not pump his fist or turn to gloat. He simply lowered the old wood bow, resting the bottom tip against his boot, and took a slow, deep breath, letting the tension drain from his shoulders. Before Chad could process the humiliation, the heavy glass doors of the clubhouse swung violently open. Thomas Wyatt, the owner of the Apex Range, and a man who usually never left his air-conditioned office on tournament weekends, marched out onto the concrete pad. He was a broad-shouldered man in his late 60s, leaning heavily on a cane. Thomas ignored the crowd and walked straight past Chad's lane, his eyes locked on the old man in the flannel shirt. "I saw that arc from the window," Thomas said, his voice carrying a raspy, booming authority. He stopped 10 feet from Lucas, staring at the Osage-orange bow. "There is only one man alive who shoots heavy cedar at that trajectory. Good Lord above." "Artie?" Lucas turned, a faint, genuine smile finally cracking his stoic expression. "Hello, Tommy. It's been a long time." Thomas let out a bark of laughter, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. He turned to look at the shattered coyote target downrange, then looked at Chad, who was pale and sweating. "Do you boys have any earthly idea who you've been standing next to for the last 2 hours?" Thomas demanded, sweeping his cane toward Chad. Chad swallowed hard, shaking his head mutely. Thomas scoffed. "No, because you think archery started when they invented the drop-away rest. That man standing right there is Sergeant Major Lucas Bennett, 75th Ranger Regiment, MAC VSOG, Recon Team Colorado. A few of the older shooters in the crowd gasped, suddenly recognizing the name. In 1971, Thomas continued, his voice ringing out over the quiet range. Lucas was dropped into the A. Shao Valley. No suppressors back then. When his unit was surrounded, he used a handcrafted takedown bow, the grandfather of the one he's holding right now, to silently eliminate 3 enemy trackers in a gale force crosswind, saving his entire squad. He didn't have a laser rangefinder. He didn't have carbon fiber stabilizers. The man taught the scout sniper instructors at Quantico how to calculate wind drift without instruments. His original bow is sitting behind bulletproof glass at the Infantry Museum in Fort Benning. Thomas turned his fierce gaze back to Chad. And you bet him you could outshoot him. The silence on the firing line was deafening. The crowd stared at Lucas with newfound reverence, the faded flannel shirt and scuffed boots suddenly looking more intimidating than any tactical camouflage money could buy. Chad Huntington looked physically ill. The platinum credit card, the $3,500 Hoyt bow, the carbon arrows, all of it felt utterly meaningless. He had challenged a living legend, a man whose skills were forged in life-or-death combat, to a parlor game of ego. And he had been thoroughly, publicly dismantled. Slowly, Chad turned away from Thomas Wyatt. He walked back to Lane 4. He didn't say a word to Bryce or Connor. His hands were shaking as he picked up his expensive bow, unclipped his custom release, and began unscrewing his stabilizers. "A bet is a bet," Chad muttered, his voice barely audible. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the keys to his truck. "I'm packing my gear. I'll leave the club." "Hold on," Lucas's deep, gravelly voice cut through the air. Chad froze, turning back. Lucas was walking toward him, his heavy boots thudding softly against the wooden decking. The crowd parted respectfully, giving the veteran ample space. Lucas stopped in front of Chad, his pale blue eyes studying the younger man. "I don't want you to leave this club," Lucas said quietly, so only Chad and his immediate friends could hear. Chad looked confused, his defensive pride flaring for a brief second. "I shook on it. I lost. I honor my bets. I said if you hit it, I'd pack up and never come back." "And if I had missed," Lucas replied, "you would have made me break a bow I've carried for 30 years and walk away from a sport I love. That wasn't a wager of skill, son. That was a wager of cruelty." Chad looked down at his boots, a flush of deep shame creeping up his neck. I was out of line. I'm sorry, sir." "You have a good eye," Lucas said, nodding toward the tight cluster of carbon arrows Chad had shot at the 80-yard target earlier. "Your form is technically sound. You've put the hours in. But you've let your equipment convince you that you are the master of the elements. You rely on machines to do the hard work of observation, and it made you arrogant." Lucas reached out and gently tapped the riser of Chad's expensive compound bow. "Machine can buy you consistency," Lucas said softly, "but it cannot buy you discipline, and it certainly cannot buy you character." Chad slowly looked up, meeting the veteran's eyes. "So, what do you want me to do?" "Keep your gear. Keep shooting at this range," Lucas said, stepping back. "But the bet stands. You owe me." "Name it," Chad said earnestly. "For the next 6 months," Lucas instructed, his tone brooking no argument. "You leave that high-tech rig in its case. You go out and buy a simple traditional recurve or longbow. No sights, no release aids, just wood, string, and your own 2 hands. You learn to feel the wind. You learn to understand the flight of the arrow. And you learn humility. You don't speak down to another archer, whether they are a child holding a plastic toy or an old man holding a piece of firewood. Chad stared at the veteran, the weight of the lesson sinking deep into his chest. It was a harsher punishment than simply leaving the range, but it was also a lifeline, a chance to actually learn the soul of the sport he claimed to love. "I will," Chad said firmly, his voice steadying. "I promise you. 6 months. Bear bull only." Lucas gave a single, curt nod. He turned around, walking back to lane 9. He meticulously checked the string of his Osage bow, slid it off the notch, and carefully slid the weapon back into its worn canvas sleeve. He packed up his remaining cedar arrows, gave a brief, silent wave to Thomas Wyatt, and walked off the firing line. Nobody spoke as Lucas Bennett walked to his rusted 1998 Ford pickup truck. They watched the old soldier load his gear, start the engine, and slowly drive down the gravel road, disappearing into the pines. Chad Huntington stood at his lane for a long time after the truck was gone. He looked down at the $3,500 bow in his hands. Then, with a quiet sigh, he zipped it into its protective case, locked it, and walked inside the clubhouse to ask Liam where he could buy a beginner's wooden recurve. The legend of the 200-yard shot would echo around the Apex range for decades. But for Chad, the real lesson wasn't the impossible geometry or the shattered coyote target. It was the realization that true mastery doesn't require a battery, a screen, or a boast. True mastery is silent, deadly, and speaks only when absolutely necessary. If this incredible, true story of humility, skill, and the timeless art of traditional archery inspired you, hit that like button right now. Don't forget to share this video with your friends, especially those who think expensive gear can replace hard work and dedication. Subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss another epic tale of real-life legends. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on Lucas's impossible shot.